So these will be for you and Anna. These will be
When I'm talking, I just look at this
Okay, yeah, it's completely fine. You can get this to like,
and then moving on the slides. Just
we have a slide event. So come.
or I can do it typically.
I just left it on that. Yeah.
So when they do the Q&A, what do they do to jump their
Just long press.
Q&A based chips
Okay.
to make the just more it's huge. Those just stay off until
Just double check out to see if the mic for the crowd works.
I might just put these here. There.
Check.
to have it out.
Yeah. Yes.
Just turn
Yes. I'm gonna show the professor how to turn it on and off. So that'll be fine. Whatever he's here.
Good evening. My name is Ann McCall, and as president of the College of Wooster, I am thrilled to welcome you, students, staff, faculty, community members, and online participants, to the kickoff of the three-part forum we're holding this year on democracy and academic freedom. This series comes thanks to the Department of Philosophy, which has dedicated 2 named lectures to this topic. We will soon deepen, complicate, and extend tonight's discussion with follow-up lectures by Dr. Jamal Green of Columbia Law School and Dr. Talise of Vanderbilt University. Please join me in thanking the Department of Philosophy, especially Dr. Evan Riley and Dr. John Rudisil for their partnership. John and Evan, please stand. Every great college has special events, unique stories that members repeat to remind ourselves who we are and what we aspire to be together. At the College of Wooster, we point to the inaugural address of our first president, Dr. Willis Lord, who claimed our college as a place of all studies and for all students. A second foundational story grounds our work in a commitment to academic freedom. I evoke it briefly now as it is foundational for our college's history, our present, and future together. In 1881, a physician and devout Presbyterian named Dr. Horace Mateer began teaching biology at the College of Wooster. In that year, Charles Darwin was still alive. Dr. Mateer began teaching elements of what we now know as evolutionary theory. About 20 years later, at the turn of the century, the Board of Trustees got a little bit nervous and questioned the potential misalignment of this controversial, unproven theory, unsettled question, with the religious affiliation of the college. Dr. Mateer responded that he understood their concerns and had originally shared them. However, the more he read and the more he studied, the more strongly he concluded that this theory was the best explanation we had this far, this way, for the world that we live in. And for that reason, he had to teach the course his way, or, as he offered to do, step down. The board responded not by banning the study of an unsettled question, but by committing additional funds to providing more scientific equipment in the hope of stimulating knowledge that would reveal the truth. How about that? Exactly. 2 decades later, President Wishart defended the college in a story that you can follow in the New York Times archives, against former Secretary of State William Jennings Bryan, who fought unsuccessfully for the Presbyterian Church to defund the College of Wooster for allowing the teaching of evolutionary theory. It is a remarkable, inspirational story, unlike the cautionary tales that led to the founding of the AAUP, for example. I therefore dedicate this series on democracy and academic freedom to Dr. Mateer, a colleague who taught based on his best understanding of available evidence, to our Board of Trustees for supporting his search for truth, and to President Wishart for protecting the college from external attacks and refraining, in spite of his own convictions, from interfering with the teaching of evolutionary biology. It is under their aegis, in tribute to their bravery and wisdom, that our college commits itself to the hard and often complicated work of nourishing free inquiry, evidence-based debate, and the production of knowledge. It is to all of you, most particularly our seniors, who are embarking on your freely chosen IS projects, that I look to for honoring our past by moving fearlessly forward with scholarly care, humility as well as conviction, and collegiality into the future. With all this and more in our minds and hearts, let us begin our series. It is now my pleasure, my deep pleasure, to introduce Dr. Darian-Smith, tonight's distinguished speaker. Dr. Darian-Smith is a distinguished professor and the founding chair of the Department of Global and International Studies at the University of California, Irvine. Trained in law, history, and anthropology, and art, she is an award-winning scholar and teacher whose work crosses disciplines and connects scholarship to urgent public issues. She has published widely, 7 books and 7 edited volumes, and her newest book, Policing Higher Education, The Antidemocratic Attack on Scholars and Why It Matters, was released this year by Johns Hopkins University Press. Beyond her scholarship, she is also a fellow at the Center for the Defense of Academic Freedom with the American Association of University Professors, where she contributes to national efforts to defend scholars facing harassment and censorship. I personally know Eve from our work together in Scholars at Risk, and I believe we actually met at the inaugural meeting for the Coalition for Academic Freedom in the Americas in Monterey. So I met her in this context of an international network of higher education institutions and individuals working together to protect scholars and promote academic freedom around the world. We are fortunate to have her with us today, fortunate to have with us a scholar who not only analyzes the challenges to academic freedom, but also actively works to defend the people and institutions at its heart. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Eve Darian-Smith.
Thank you so much, Anne, for such a lovely, lovely introduction. Before we begin, I just also want to thank Doctors Riley Evan and John Rudisill from the Department of Philosophy for hosting this very important series, for President McCall for inaugurating the series and honoring your legacy here at the College of Wooster. I'm very excited to be here. I'm the first of a three-part lecture series, and I gather that the next person is coming to the conversation about academic freedom from a legal perspective, and the third person is coming from a philosophical perspective. I'm coming to you today with my sort of history hat on and my global studies hat on, and going to talk a little bit more broadly, as it were, to sort of introduce the bigger picture of the U.S. context. So while the 2 other speakers, I think, will be focusing very much on the U.S., I'll be talking about the sort of historical, comparative, global arena in which attacks on higher education are sort of to be understood in the current moment. This is also, I want to say before I begin, a very personal conversation and personal topic, the attack on higher education, and particularly the attack on international students and faculty. I came to the United States from Australia. You might hear my accent. I don't think I have an accent anymore. My students always say, "You're from Britain." I say, "No, I'm not. I'm not British. I'm Australian." And if you know anything about Australia, being called British is not the right sort of accusation. But so, you know, I would not be here today talking to you if I hadn't have had that opportunity as an international student to come to the United States and take advantage of what is, at the moment, still most extraordinary intellectual higher education sector in the world. So it's what's unfolding right now is deeply personal to me, because to me, I wouldn't be here without the sort of support and the embrace of international students from the past, and I fear very much greatly for the future of higher education in the United States without that international component. So as a professor of global studies, I'm keen to show that the assault on higher education is part of a much bigger global trend. In some ways, this is sort of comforting, in a way, right? We're not the only higher education sector that is under this kind of oppressive attack. But it's also deeply disconcerting to appreciate that what is unfolding here in the United States has been unfolding in other countries for some years, if not decades, and that in a sense, we're sort of catching up with a trend that is undermining the capacity for critical inquiry around the world. So, you know, it's a two-step there. Both we're not alone, but also that the problem is of a scale that I think many people in the United States don't really appreciate. In trying to get my thoughts together today for this talk, it was hard for me to focus given the daily barrage, as we've all become a little bit overwhelmed by, of news items, executive orders, news of tariffs going up and down, social media blasts, and so on over the last 9 months since the start of President Trump's second administration. I am acutely aware that we are in an extraordinary moment in US and global history where the basic principles of democracy are under attack. How we think about responding to the various interconnected crises facing the world and how we talk about these crises among ourselves has been front and center for me and my faculty and my students, and I imagine is front and center too amongst all of you who have been back in the new fall term for a week or so. So, in short, I am deeply appreciative of being here today among friends, both old and new. It's wonderful to see familiar faces, able to talk freely for the moment about power, greed, and rising authoritarianism, and specifically how this impacts higher education. And in short, I will never, ever again, and I hope none of us in this room will ever, ever again take for granted the extraordinary privilege of working and living and breathing and conversing in a culture and a space that encourages critical inquiry. We can never take academic freedom for granted ever again after what we're seeing unfold today. So I wrote this book, Policing Higher Education, which I'm very pleased I got a grant to make it open access, so no one ever has to pay for it, which to me is very, very important because it's speaking to the United States, but it also is speaking to a global audience. And I've been studying the rise of authoritarianism and the far right for over a decade now, but this new book represents a specific interest in two global trends. One is the rise of global authoritarianism and a correlative decline in academic freedom and critical inquiry around the world. And as Anne mentioned in her opening, Scholars at Risk has been incredibly important. There are other civil society organizations and NGOs and so on, but Scholars at Risk, which was established well over 2 decades ago, has been very, very central in monitoring and reporting on the rise of rising authoritarianism and declining academic freedom for many years now. And it brings out a Free to Think report every year, which has incredible statistics, and is about to bring out their November 2025 report. This is from last year's report, but you can see there very quickly just how quickly the academic freedom index is indicating that there is a decline, and of course the United States is now in the picture, which 5 years ago it would not have been, right? So this is a rather rapid, momentous decline within the United States. And as a result, there's been a lot of scholarship around the world, across the Americas, across Africa, across the Middle East and Asia, around this concern about declining academic freedom. This is just one of many, many panels that you can go onto, YouTube and have access to. Rob Quinn is the center person there, and he is the founding executive director of Scholars at Risk. There's a lot of conversation beyond the US academic world, at least until rather recently. So I got interested, not what was going on overseas. My initial interest was what was happening in the United States, in states like Florida under Governor DeSantis, and Texas and Georgia and so on, with the extraordinary amount of book bans, right? Which exploded across Republican-led states in 2021. Here's a graph that you can see that's relatively a constant of the books that were brought to the attention of libraries and primary schools and high schools requesting to ban certain content. And the requests are very, very stable, right, for 2 decades until 21-22, right? And this is the Republican-led states, an incredible legislative assault on primarily primary school and secondary schools, but of course bleeding into higher education, trying to curtail certain conversations, as we know, around race, gender, sexuality, and so on. And this is just a map of Penn that puts out this incredible tracking mechanisms of what were called educational gag orders or woke legislation, where you can see curriculum in colleges and universities starting to be suppressed and to be surveyed and to be censored, right? So that was my concern in writing initially in writing the book. Of course, now in 2025, the entire country, not just Republican-led states, is deeply, deeply engaged with the attack on higher education. This came about in a large degree to the student protests, as we know, that happened across many college campuses last spring semester, and of course happened across many colleges and universities around the world. This happens to be my university. In May 2024, last year, a very serious event happened. The president of the university said there was potential violence. The campus went into lockdown. Within 3 hours, there was 300 and something riot police on campus. That we had helicopters circling overhead. It was extremely distressing for everybody. And the end result was that 47 students and a few faculty were arrested as they sat in quiet prayer on the football field. So there was no violence or anything like that. So, you know, the protests, the student protests really did bring the attention of the Republican Party to use student protests as a mechanism, as we know, to weaponize student protests to say that there was rampant violence and anti-Semitism on many campuses. And we have now seeing how that weaponization has materialized in real terms over the last 6 months or so. So now, just since the beginning of this year, we have had an extraordinary array of executive orders, of which some of you know a lot about, I'm sure. We've had words that are being told we cannot teach with. So in our university, we're being told that our syllabi cannot have the words race and gender in the titles of the courses. And these are just some of the words that are being eviscerated both on college campuses but across federal agencies and bureaucracies. Words like gender, climate justice, social equity, equal opportunity, equality, and so on. So this is really 1984, George Orwell, sort of disappearing of words in a very, very eerie fashion. We're also seeing, of course, attacks on DEI officers and a whole sort of reconfiguration of how to do diversity initiatives and programming on campuses that every single university and college across the country is grappling with. We're seeing extraordinary defunding of research of all sorts, not just, you know, medical research, but research across the board, which is really making most university campuses extremely nervous about how they're actually going to produce and continue to produce groundbreaking scholarship and research. And we're seeing, probably most distressingly, I think for everyone, some disappearances of students from campus grounds, the threat of ICE on campus grounds, and a sort of general sense of pervasive stress, anxiety, and surveillance, which is, of course, the intention of the Republican Party. So, in sum, today's educational crisis threatens a person's right to pursue knowledge, think critically, and challenge the status quo. And this is occurring through a variety of mechanisms, as I've mentioned, you know, taking down diversity initiatives, policing curriculum, and so on. Now, some people would say, this has happened before, right? We've seen attacks on higher education over the last 30, 40, 50 years in the United States. There's no need to get totally alarmed. This is just a sort of one of those cycles, historical cycles. Things will be okay. We just have to sort of hunker down and not come under the attention of any oppressive external force. In short, they want to dismiss the scale and significance of what we're experiencing around us today. And in what follows, I want to sort of counter that. I think there are rhymes of the past that we're seeing emerging today, and that the attack on higher education has a decades-long history, but the actual intensity of what we're seeing today is unique and unprecedented. So it's sort of a complicated, because history is really important to see how we came to be, and what actually are echoing in the current moment, but I also want to reiterate towards the end of my talk that this is completely unparalleled in the history of higher education in the US. So I'm just going to do a couple of quick slides, and hopefully some of you know this history, and if you don't worry, that's why I'm here, just to give you a refresher about the history of attacks on higher education in the US more general. So of course we typically talk about McCarthyism in the 1950s, early 1950s, and the scare of communism, in which about 600 public intellectuals and scholars were brought before a huge inquiry, and then there was certainly a chilling factor on college and university campuses around what you could say and what could be taught and researched and so on. But it was a very particular targeting of individual scholars and faculty. It doesn't mean that it wasn't extremely, disturbing for college communities, and many of these people actually lost their jobs, but it was a specific targeting of individuals, right? It wasn't an attack on the higher education sector per se, which is what's happening today. So that's the early 50s. In 1958, President Eisenhower signs the National Defense Education Act, which people really don't often talk about, and he requested researchers to sign loyalty oaths. So I want you to just think about that. I'm anticipating, unfortunately, that probably in the near future, some of us faculty will be asked, in order to receive any kinds of funding, that we will be signing a loyalty oath. And certainly already now, as we know, if you have a grant that's with the NSF or the NEH or the NIH, if you do any research on gender issues or climate issues or race issues, you are in a sense already being vetted out to not receive additional funding. So it's a loyalty oath in a sort of roundabout way. Of course, the backlash to the 1950s was an incredible eruption of free speech activism on campuses. The free speech movement at Berkeley was sort of the pinnacle, one of the pinnacle hubs of all these conversations. San Francisco State University had National Guard brought in, student strikes went on for weeks and weeks and weeks. This was very much a movement amongst the students arguing that the curriculum should be expanded, that they shouldn't be subject to FBI surveillance, that they shouldn't be drafted to go to the Vietnam War. So there were a lot of issues at hand, but it was not just about the Vietnam War, it was also about a demand by students requiring or demanding that the universities open up the curriculum for a much more inclusive, diverse set of conversations that included Black studies, feminist women's studies, ethnic studies. So there's all these studies, these interdisciplinary hubs of activity, they have their roots in these free speech movements, and many universities put in these departments. This is an incredible photo from, again, Berkeley and the People's Park protests that were very violent, and you can see a lot of information freely available on Google. And of course, closer to home here, the killing of 4 students at Kent State. So this was a very pinnacle moment in which National Guard were brought to campus. 4 students, most of them not participating in any kind of protest, were killed. And you have the song that some of you know, I'm sure, written by Neil Young, Ohio, right? So this was an incredible moment of campus unrest across the country. And as a result, you had students at the University of New Mexico taking over the Student Union building. Every campus, basically, there were protests. University of Washington, Seattle, there you also see the National Guard. So it was a pretty amazing decade here of disruption, student protests, but in the name of opening up conversations for diversity, inclusion, bigger enrollments of minority students and so on. Before I move away from that sort of historical context, I want to give another side to it, because often in these conversations, people don't get the sort of political context in which campus protests were occurring. And it's important to sort of draw the connections here, I think. 63, we've got Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, right? This is an extraordinary moment of galvanizing political and civil rights in the United States. And in the most incredible speech. If you've never heard it, you must go and listen to it. I assume you've all heard it. We also have, a year later, the assassination of John F. Kennedy. Right? And John F. Kennedy, the president at the time, was extremely important. He and Martin Luther King had many conversations. JFK was very, very important in putting into place the process for the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act of 64 and 65. And many people, historians, would argue that's the sort of context of the assassination. But so, you know, this is a huge, huge event. Civil Rights Act comes in, which is so incredibly important, basically dismantling Jim Crow and saying all peoples have the capacity to participate in civil and political life. And then the following year, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which, if you are following the news, is actively and aggressively being dismantled as we speak, right? So there are these echoes of the past in what we're seeing now. And then, of course, you have the assassination on April 4th of Martin Luther King, right? So this is the sort of histories of the 60s, 50s, and 60s, student activism, what the students and faculty are fighting for, what it means to have a much more inclusive academic community, and there is a severe backlash, severe, right? Both here and in other countries. But in the United States, this is the backlash, the conservative backlash against campuses and colleges. You have Nixon saying, quote, "Never forget, the press is the enemy." We have attacks right now on journalists. The establishment is the enemy, the attack on so-called establishment. But the professors are the enemy. Professors are the enemy. Write that on a blackboard 100 times and never forget it. So there needed to be a scapegoat. The Vietnam War had gone terribly, terribly wrong. Students are protesting. They need to be managed. The political landscape then has a backlash and says students need to be brought under control, faculty need to be brought under control. The word woke was not used then, but it could have been, right? Completely out of control, liberal faculty need to be brought to heel. And you have the same language rhyming today with the vice president. Okay, so there are echoes, as I mentioned before, of the past with today's attack. But the scale and the intensity and the long-term consequences are, in my argument, extremely different from what we've had in the past. We have the dismantling of the Department of Education. So while Congress is the only supposed body that can dismantle the Department of Education, under the Trump administration, half the staff in the Department of Education have been sacked. And so, in effect, it has been gutted and dismantled. It's not functioning in the way it is meant to function. Many grants are being held up, affecting, primary school, high school, and higher education. This is an extraordinary turnabout, right? This is a new, unprecedented action at the federal level. We're also seeing many, many faculty around the country thinking that if they had the opportunity, which there are very, very few opportunities for ordinary faculty to get a job overseas, they might consider leaving. So there's this talk of a brain drain, that actually universities and colleges are going to lose the best researchers and the best teachers, and they will go to Europe or Australia or Canada. The reality is there aren't any jobs, really, only for a few very, very important Yale professors at the University of Toronto. But nonetheless, people are still talking about if they had the chance, they might consider leaving the country, which is, it blows my mind, right? Who would have thought that 9 months ago people would even be talking like this? And there is real concern that even if leading faculty and teachers cannot leave the country because there's no other jobs, there is still a sense that international faculty and international students will not come here, and that the extraordinary higher education sector of the United States, which leads the world, rightly or wrongly, but it does lead the world, that the higher education sector will now seriously be threatened in reputation, if not in material practice. So this is completely new. The other thing that I think is very different, even though there was a chilling effect from McCarthyism and sort of the attacking and the surveying of people associated with communist ideologies, I think what I'm seeing now is a pervasive fear across all campuses where people are very uncomfortable about talking, sharing their ideas, certainly talking in a big lecture hall like this. And I'm certainly experiencing it. I think everyone else is too. And as you know, the University of California system, many other colleges start a little bit later than you. We're all talking about it because we start classes in a couple of weeks, and everyone is extremely agitated about what's going to transpire. Sort of there's a silencing and this fear of going to university and colleges. So how did we get here? How did we get here? Which is a very, very important and good question. I want to argue that to answer this, we must appreciate that attacks on higher education in the United States are connected to similar battles over the freedom to think in other so-called democracies such as Brazil, Poland, Thailand, Mexico, Argentina, Hungary, India, and the Philippines. These attacks, I argue, are related to a global rise in authoritarian-leaning governments that includes, of course, the Trump administration. This phenomenon is powerfully described by numerous scholars. There's a whole new slew of research and scholarship talking about this cadre of far-right leaders around the world who typically know each other, typically have quite volatile relationships. Think of Trump and Modi in recent times. But there's a lot of scholarship coming out. A couple that I would just like to highlight are Anne Applebaum, her new book called Autocracy, Inc., The Dictators Who Want to Rule the World, and a more sort of philosophical book by Alberto Toscano called Late Fascism, in which he talks about the word fascism, how people are very uncomfortable about that word, and it's typically associated, as we know, with Italian and German ideologies in the 1920s and 30s. But in his argument, he says if you take fascism as a set of conditions of oppression, forget about the formal ideology, you can see these conditions way back across decades and centuries into colonial imperial times, and you can see the conditions of fascism as they are playing out in the current moment. So it's a very interesting and very, very deep political theory about fascism, which I deeply appreciate. And he says explicitly, the rise of the far right is a global phenomenon. So extremist political leaders, mostly, as I said before, mostly men, but not all, are forming a cadre of power brokers that share strategies and policies that include the dismantling of higher education as we know it. And this is a sort of checklist that people have been sort of sharing around, and you can see there, and you can think about what's happening in the United States, you know, controlling the media, controlling elections, controlling the judicial system, which was seen with the Supreme Court, but also controlling higher education. Higher education is one of the sort of toolboxes that you have to tick off in terms of building your authoritarian administration. What anti-democratic leaders, both here and overseas, are intent on silencing is critical research and teaching that challenges the status quo and specifically their anti-democratic authority to govern. So that's why higher education is part of this longer list, and we're lumped in with the judiciary and the military and the free press, right? That's why, because colleges are a space and a place that ideally nurturing and supporting critical ideas, new ideas, people asking why is that so, and could we change it, and how would we think about it, and so on. And so that's exactly what is required by authoritarian leaders to be silenced. Something else that I think you will come up in different conversations with the two additional lecture speakers is one of the mechanisms that we're also seeing is the reduction of academic freedom, which is the right of the expert scholar in their professional community, being reduced to the right of free speech, which is, you know, is relevant to every single individual. So this is a sort of strategy that's very, very slippery slope, because by arguing that free speech should be protected, you're also arguing, and then academic freedom is equivalent to free speech, you're also saying that someone off the street could come in and should have access to a group of students and present themselves as an expert as your faculty are in the same way, and they're not. So be very attentive to how this sort of slippery slope of reducing academic freedom of speech to free speech, and First Amendment right, is occurring, because it's occurring in very similar ways in many other countries as well. So I want to argue that, that in the US, we need to see conflict over education as much more than part of the ongoing cultural wars. This is an approach that pits one side against another as if equal adversaries over identity politics, religious politics, and so on. In contrast, I argue we should be thinking about educational conflict in terms of intensifying structural battles over economic and political power associated with what the theorist Wendy Brown calls the crisis of neoliberalism. Putting this differently, attacks on academic freedom are emblematic of a world order in which the scaffolding power dynamics of the post-Second World War era are increasingly being destabilized. And what we are seeing is a global political economy dominated by billionaires. We all know the kind of billionaires that come to mind, Elon Musk in technology, big banks, defense manufacturers, and so on, who are manipulating political leaders to deregulate government oversight and in effect enable them to have access to tax breaks and amass enormous wealth, right? This structural geopolitical stabilization is unfolding on a global stage, yet it is fought in the everyday, rather mundane domestic experiences of teachers and students in the classroom, in the research lab, and in the lecture hall, right? And so I want you to think about what goes on in your classroom space as part of a bigger global context of shifting power dynamics, economic dynamics going on around the world. It's a much bigger geopolitical conversation, but it does play out in how you and I get to speak about what we get to speak in the classroom. Trump and other autocrats know that knowledge is power, and that any independent and critical expertise must be wiped out. So alongside the attack on higher education, as we know, there's now an extremely aggressive attack on all federal bureaucracies and agencies. Many employees, tens of thousands of employees have lost their jobs. And these are the people that have been trained in colleges and universities around the world with expertise that then have had careers as public servants in these federal agencies now losing their jobs, right? So it is an attack in a sense on knowledge itself that we are experiencing, even though in this room it's typically within our campus culture and community. And so this is why you're seeing an extreme number of executive orders against climate science and the dismantling of NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, causing all sorts of global problems, right? Because many, many countries rely upon this agency to help them predict tsunamis, earthquakes, droughts, and so on. We're seeing an attack on labor and employment expertise, where the chief commissioner's labor statistics didn't sit well with the administration, and that person was fired. We're seeing an attack on medical expertise. Here with Dr. Monrez and the Center for Infectious Diseases and so on, fighting it out about vaccines, polio vaccines, what can be used, what cannot be used, and so on. So medical expertise is being attacked in a very distressing way. We're seeing an attack on economic expertise. I've been watching the last couple of weeks. Lisa Cook, who has refused to step down, I don't know how it's going to play out as being on the board of the Federal Reserve, and absolutely sending, rightly so, the business community of the world into turmoil because the Federal Reserve is meant to be independent, economic, and is the sort of platform on which the global political economy has, the last 50, 60 years, depended. So if the Federal Reserve is going to be the plaything of an autocrat, the whole economic system doesn't now know where to turn for sort of independent scrutiny and data, right? So, you know, you have commentaries just absolutely going bananas about the Federal Reserve in a way that they haven't gone about other issues, but William Galston, for instance, at the Brookings Institute, this is a quote, says, "Should the credibility of the Federal Reserve be compromised, it could threaten the stability of the world economy." So that is where we're at, so rapidly, so quickly. So, what can we do? In the last sort of couple of minutes that we have together, I want to sort of at least try and end on some optimistic note, right? And says, "Well, have you got any hope?" And I say, "I've got hope in my pocket." You know, we've got to have some hope here somewhere. So I go back to history, actually, for my hope. So these are the protests in Paris in May in 1968. Remember, a month earlier, Martin Luther King was assassinated. So these things are connected in ways that are hard for us to put together, but they are. And this protests in Paris, which started actually in smaller towns in France, but then spread all over France and spread all over Europe, in Amsterdam, in Rome. They spread then into Mexico City, around the world, in Sydney and in Melbourne. The Paris student revolution, as it was sort of known at the time, was extremely important. And to me, I just want to read you a little bit about this combination of protests. So the May 1968 protests in France began with student demonstrations against university conditions and authoritarianism, which quickly escalated into a massive general strike involving millions of workers, bringing the country to a near standstill. The collaboration between students and workers led to demands for social and political reforms, better wages, improved working conditions, and ultimately forced the government to negotiate and make concessions on their behalf. And it had been going on for some months. By May, the strike spread across France, paralyzing much of the country and involving approximately 10 million workers, people who had no direct relationship to university or college campuses or higher education. And this was the largest general strike in French history, 10 million people. So I take inspiration from that because it began with students demanding and asking for and criticizing the authoritarian government that they were working under. And they worked in extremely important alliances and solidarity connections with workers, trade union movements, all sorts of people, farmers, agricultural workers across the countryside and so on. This to me is hopeful, because it means that actually if we can make new kinds of alliances amongst different colleges, small rural colleges, tribal colleges, community colleges, and then with big public institutions, elites like Harvard and Yale and so on, if we could actually start doing some coalition building both within higher education sector, but then also translate that conversation to a much wider group of people who may not aspire to go to university, nor have the means, the financial means to go to college, right? That this is a much bigger conversation that you could all participate in. And you see the beginnings of this, from the labs to the streets, building solidarity. So there is a lot of momentum, grassroots groups, trying to actually connect what's going on in the classroom and the surveillance of critical thought to a working kind of conditioned conversation that's much bigger and involves the majority of the people in the United States. You saw the beginning of this only a couple of days ago, on Monday, September 1st, Labor Day, and there were lots and lots and lots of protests, from small protests to larger ones in major cities across the country, that I thought was very, very interesting. Education didn't really play a part in these conversations, which is a great pity, but I do think that working people are starting to mobilize, and trade unions are more popular than they have been for 30 or 40 years in the United States, even against Trump's completely aggressive attack on trade union power. So there is possibility there. That's my hope, to try and build these sort of coalitions. I also want to always point out that we are very privileged, and we must always be speaking for those who cannot speak out in public spaces. So that's a sort of a reminder to us that ICE and the police surveillance on the streets is going to escalate very dramatically in the next 6 to 10 months, and that we need to be very, very aware that we are privileged in our voice and a capacity to speak out, at least now, where others cannot. So I'm going to leave you here with this slide, maybe not on this slide. I think it's vital that we get better about connecting the message that our education fails without academic freedom, as this poster points out, to another related message that is our democracy fails without education, right? So we've got to take it from this classroom to the next level, education and democracy. And I think this is summed up extremely well by a former employee of the US Department of Agriculture for 35 years, a woman called Ellen Hornstein. She says, if Trump can tell schools what to teach, he can tell us what to think, And without the freedom to think and to learn, we will no longer have a free country. And I think that there is the simple language that speaks to me, and I think could speak to a much wider audience beyond our own academic communities. So as we huddle together and think about hope and positivity and how we can actually make a difference, think of those students in the Paris streets, and think of someone who's lost their job in one of the federal agencies, and how academic freedom is an issue of democracy, and democracy is an issue of freedom to participate in the life that you want to participate for yourself and your children. So with that, I will leave it. Thank you.
So thank you, Eve, for that brilliant talk. Let's hear it again for one of the things that I found most compelling in Eve's book is the very clear line that she draws between desire for financial primacy and extreme wealth and academic freedom, which is something that I think in general we don't really talk about as much, and also this resolutely international framework for it. So I know I have questions for her, but I think we should start with all of you tonight. Evan has offered to be our mic runner in the room. You know, faculty do it all. And so if you have, I'll keep my questions to myself until we run out of questions from the room. Evan, would you like to, who would like to speak first? Ask a question.
Hi. I'm Olivia. I'm a student here. I'm a philosophy major senior. The stuff I'm concerned about here is what happens when we, well, if or when we fail. Fail to continue to protect free speech. You know, schools get worse, everything gets worse. What sorts of systems, what do we have to do then? What sorts of systems do we put in place? Those are the sorts of things I'm thinking about. And so when I'm looking at these problems, I'm trying to think about how do we, you know, make sure I've got a younger brother, he's just entering middle school. How can I, you know, make sure to be talking to him about these issues? And how can we be setting up, like is there room outside of protests? Is there room outside of these, you know, outside of higher education to still to be attacking these issues in a different way? And also, I'm thinking about what are the risks, if there are other systems, which I hope there are because we might lose, what are the risks of relying too heavily on institutions that can be attacked so directly by decreasing funding, right? These super formal and important and powerful institutions, but is there something to do with putting too many eggs in one basket, so to speak?
Well, it's a very big question, and I don't have really, you know, obvious answers or simple answers. I think in all the activities we do, you know, we're all individuals with so much energy and time and so on. So, you know, there has to be something that comes individually from you and what you're capable of doing in your own motivations and your own desires and passions. But I do think that talking amongst yourselves, talking amongst with younger brothers, talking with grandparents, talking with people on the bus stop who may not go to college, talking in general about the concerns that people have and how education at whatever level is vital for us to live in a diverse and democratic society. So it's a bland response. I don't, you know, you want different systems. I think we still have to fight very, very hard for our colleges. We still have to fight very, very hard for funding for research. We still have to step up and talk with the leaders of our community spaces at all times. And so that to me is always essential, that we don't turn our back on leadership, that it's a conversation, because you have to build a very strong, robust institutional space here so that some of you may go off and talk to other colleges or other, communities in the state or beyond the state, right? So I don't have simple solutions, except we have to be aware what's going on. There's my badge. We have to be aware what's going on. We have to talk all the time about it, share our distress, and try not to go into our deep little huddle by ourselves under our bed, because that's exactly what people want us to do. So I hear you about a younger brother coming up and, very, very fearful. Make sure you have copies of the books that you love in the house so that your younger brother can read books always, and go and support your local library. There are things like that you can get out and sort of diverse the conversation more broadly beyond the classroom. But it starts in the classroom, I do want to say, because I feel that the classroom is where all instructors and faculty are trying to create a space for people to discuss their anxieties and these kinds of questions. Your question is being asked by everyone. So do make sure that you really participate in classroom conversations as well, right? Because that's where it starts, small, where you're at. But you're the future too. I want to hear we can have another conversation where you think things might happen in a good way.
Hi, I'm Zoe Martin. I'm a freshman. How has the overall defunding of research impacted research efforts at Wooster, or has it had an impact yet?
Okay, I think that one's for me. We are not deeply impacted by this. There are some grants that were pooled, but as an undergraduate college, we are touched by that less than larger or wealthy research universities. Where we have more vulnerability for funding is student financial aid. And we receive, when everything is all put together in a pot, about $12 million a year that way. It's a significant part of our budget.
Hi, I'm Selena. I'm a senior philosophy major, and I was kind of wondering, when I try to talk to people in my family and my friends about these issues and kind of get them more engaged with the world and how everything is happening, they seem to really turn away in fear and not want to accept the reality that we're living in, and kind of just go to a world of like delusion, or it's not that severe, it's not that different, we haven't we've seen this before, that kind of attitude. But I've just been struggling to try to get people to accept the severity of the issue and also want to engage in some sort of resistance or action. So I don't know if you have advice on that.
Another very, very important and an issue that I think for many, many, many people will hear you because it resonates with them. I mean, Thanksgiving and holidays, table spaces can be quite awkward and quite anxious-making, and I appreciate that very much. I think it's important that your parents and family, you try to engage in conversations. That's all I can say. You may be shut out, you may be told you're not really aware of what's really going on, things will get better or whatever. I mean, people handle these kinds of transitions in very, very different ways. Some people are, to the battlefront, I'm going to put on my boots and get out there, and others want to hide in the cupboard. And so you have to be sympathetic and generous and sensitive to how people respond in a variety of ways. At the same token, when it's your own family members, it's very distressing because, you want to talk about it, right? So I don't have any advice other than keep talking if you can, and be very aware that people can only sort of think about so many things at once. But I do think your parents would be very, very pleased in the long run to hear from you, and that you don't shush up, right? It's important that you are not silenced in spaces that are very meaningful to you for your family dynamics. But it's like, people talking about religion around the Thanksgiving table as well. So there are analogies, and I do think that speaking respectfully and listening to others across different generations is very important, but don't silence yourself is what I'm saying too.
There are times when this comes, sorry, my name is Axel, I'm a student here. There are times when it comes into direct conflict, though, when like you're having a conversation and maybe it's somebody has some power over you and they take measures. Maybe it's somebody at the administration of your college that make it harder to protest. They put these barriers between your action and the results you want. When it's like that, when it's people you don't want to consider as like your enemies, when it's people who are supposed to be helping you, supporting you, and these are people who are previously professors, what do you do in that situation? Because you don't want to alienate them, right?
No.
What's the right move?
Do you have any advice, Anne?
I think keep talking is.
Yeah.
I mean, I know that doesn't sound very satisfactory, but it's true. And I think looking for areas where people coming from different perspectives can find something that they can work on together.
Yeah.
So I would make a link with the last question, actually. There are many people or families that may not know or care so much or feel that it's so, I mean, I see it in my own family, it's so serious what's going on, but they are very concerned that entire squadrons of Hurricane Hunter planes, the pilots have all been fired.
Right.
They're concerned about polio coming back. And so sometimes thinking about a topic, like that might be really important to your grandparents, or because that's when the shots came out, right? Or something where we all play different roles too. So there are things that you may be able to do that I'm not allowed to do, or I can't do, or I couldn't do without endangering, or I don't believe I could without endangering the context you're in. So we have to find different ways that we can fulfill our roles in ways that end up supporting each other. And understanding sometimes too that we'll have differences, just complete differences in appreciating the situations. But I think one of the hallmarks of academic freedom and an open society in general is that you're not always going to agree with everybody. It doesn't mean you necessarily it doesn't necessarily mean that you disrespect each other because you differ on a particular issue. Sometimes that's hard to accept, but I think most of us have family that we love and we don't agree on all topics, or we vote for candidates where we agree with maybe 70 or 80% of what they support, but we really disagree on others. So how do we deal with those areas of disagreement within overall agreement? We're not clones of each other, right? So I think there's also a hard apprenticeship into living and working with people with whom you don't always agree.
Which is probably not what you wanted to hear.
Hi, my name is Nathan. I'm a sophomore here at the College of Wooster. I was wondering on what your thoughts were on the why the administration is attacking higher education. I know that most of the voters didn't have that opportunity to get the higher education, so they might feel a bit of envy or jealousy, or they're targeting higher education so that people are more easily manipulable. But some would say that you can apply really reason to people like that. Not to draw any comparisons and say the wrong thing, but trying to figure out why Hitler hated all the Jews and wanted to kill them. You can't apply reason to that kind of person, that kind of thinking. So I was wondering what your thoughts on the why and the reasons why.
So it's an excellent question. So, and this is a long question, a long set of answers, and I'll try and be brief. The Republican Party has, for decades and decades, targeted higher education. So that's why I brought in the historical context there. It was the professors are the enemy from 1970s, and that narrative has been bubbling along very, very, very under the radar for decades. So in about 2014, the Republican Party strategically set out to create a narrative that made the public distrustful of higher education, of colleges and universities, because it hadn't got much traction, the professors are the enemy kind of narrative. And if you read Project 2025, which you won't have because it's 800 pages, but you can get analyses of sections of it, which is the blueprint that the Heritage Foundation and other conservative think tanks put together as a blueprint for the Trump second administration, you will see that there is a whole conversation about building the momentum to make the general public, whether they had attended higher education or not, generally distrustful of faculty and professors and intellectual work. And so it is being a sort of targeted momentum building for decades. From 2014 it was explicit in the Heritage Foundation, and then now it's just been sort of written, and Trump is basically going through Project 2025 and putting into place exactly what has already been strategically and carefully organized behind the scenes. So I don't know whether that really answers your question, but there is a general distrust of all institutions, be it the judiciary, be it the police, be it higher education, be it the medical hospital system, that has been deliberately fostered to create a sense of anxiety about established knowledge, data-based evidence, and of course the communities and cultures of colleges. I think there is an element of people not knowing what goes on in colleges by a large percentage of the population that may have voted for the Trump administration in the second term. And so it's easily manipulated narrative that actually can build momentum with no basis whatsoever. It doesn't really answer your question, but it's a very interesting sort of sequence historically and in the current moment that has played out, deliberately orchestrated and organized.
Hi, I'm Lauren. I'm a senior political science major at the college. I am extremely, extremely concerned with the concept of legitimacy. I feel like we are getting to a point where even if academic freedom is protected, there are these very targeted campaigns against the legitimacy of higher education, or in specifics, the legitimacy of specific topics in higher education. Things that are classified as DEI are being completely delegitimized as influential, important, meaningful topics of research, things in the climate change department, et cetera. So even if we are able to be in a university that allows for these protections, even if in the future things improve, there is such a large percentage of the population that at this point just does not believe in that sort of research. And I am concerned for what sort of future that entails. How do we re-legitimize these sort of things? How do we emphasize to people that they are important, even if our freedoms remain intact?
So another excellent question, very good questions all around. I think your concern about delegitimizing certain topics is absolutely spot on. I also want to sort of push back and say that actually I think for the majority of the US population, people are concerned about climate, right? And I think for the majority of particularly younger generations, people are very sensitive and sympathetic to issues of race and gender and sexuality. So I actually have sort of quietly hopeful that the general population is not given the opportunity to talk about these issues will come round, right? I think that there's a lot of silencing in the middle of the spectrum. I think there's, on the very far right, there's a very vocal, very loud, very aggressive, very well-funded dominance of a lot of these conversations. But, just take climate science. I mean, this last series of hurricanes and tornadoes and heat waves and so on, people cannot deny their physical material realities really much longer. And so while, Trump administration would say climate science is a hoax and it's all just made up or whatever, and deny, the reality is that the ordinary person on the street knows that temperature is getting hotter and fresh water is getting harder and crops are dying and they will not have fresh fruit and so on. So I think the material context of what we are living in will actually win out against these extreme narratives that are getting an extraordinary airplay and dominate the news cycles. So, I suppose I'm optimistic that the legitimacy argument is going to flounder in the face of reality. And young generations, as I say, are much happier with conversations around gender and sexuality and racism than older generations on the conservative side. And you are all going to be taking leadership roles. You are leaving college. You will be taking these conversations with you in your future jobs, and you are the future. And so I think that's why I'm quietly optimistic, that delegitimacy argument cannot continue to contain that kind of intensity and effectiveness for that much longer if people's material conditions are changing rapidly around them.
I can't resist anymore. I have to ask a question because it's right here in the interstices of those two questions. Is it really about us at all?
Mm-hmm.
Is it really? Because you had the list of 10 things that need to be muzzled in order to create the autocratic state. If in the end, it's easy to beat up on colleges and universities, there are actually not that many of us. We're easily defined. You can see us. It's easy to point us out to the world. We're centers of potential dissent at all times. Okay. But what about those 9 other things? So does it even, the fight against the areas of knowledge that so many of us care about is real, but is it even really about that?
And I think you're absolutely right. We're just one front in a much larger system of potential oppression, right? So we're all fighting about, can I do my work on, the history of racism and blah, blah, blah. I don't think it really is about us. We feel it very significantly because this is the work we do, this is the world we love, this is the kind of, pedagogical mission that faculty have always, engaged with. And hopefully students come to learn and converse with each other. But it's not really about us. I mean, it is and it isn't, because this is a much bigger problem, which gets back to one of the questions earlier about talking to family around the Thanksgiving table or whatever it is. It's about whether one can get the polio vaccine for your newborn baby. It's about whether you do have access to fresh fruit and vegetables. I keep that coming back to me because from California, the whole Central Valley, which produces 70 to 80% of fresh fruit and vegetables for the country, that fruit is not being picked. That is rotting because all the migrant workers are hiding from ICE. So I think it's in the bigger picture is important as we get, focus on higher education, but it's really part of one connecting dot into a whole system of increasing oppression that we have to be very, very aware of, right? And so the judicial system was taken over with very, very little public outcry. Very little public outcry. And that's now, of course, why a lot of law schools are being targeted by the Trump administration, because they're the next future generation of judges and attorneys and so on, who hopefully will fight back. But your question is absolutely pertinent, Anne. Is it about us? Yes, it's about us, but it's also about us being on one front in a much bigger battlefront of potential oppression.
Hi, over here. I'm Lucia. I'm a senior, double major in history and education. I was really interested in what you were talking about with student movements. So I know students and faculty and staff, they do a lot of work and are credited with leading the charge for a lot of these progressive movements. But colleges are also made up of administrators. How much responsibility do the administrators have to listen to and support their students? And what should students do when the administration is valuing its economic stability over free expression and progress for its students?
That's a very, very good question. So it is a balancing act. I wouldn't want to be in any administrative leadership of a college or university in this time, because it's this balancing act about whether you at least feel that it's the continuity of the college itself, and that has the longer, more impactful way forward, rather than stepping back and making some political statement or something. At the same time, I've always been a person that's marched on the streets. I've been arrested. As long as, to me, you know, I can't say go off and march and protest, but certainly if things are done with civility, respect, non-violence, and so on, I think you should protest. Just as a side note, I'm particularly proud of this. A couple of weekends ago, it was estimated 200,000 to 300,000 people in Sydney marched across the Harbour Bridge in the rain in support of peace. And they were told they couldn't march. The government said you can't, they're going to block the Sydney Harbour Bridge. The community pressed back. It was not reported in any American media, mainstream media, but this is 300,000 people in the rain with families marching for peace. And it wasn't even all about Gaza, it was about peace. So I think you should march. I think you should all know yourselves to march and to talk and walk, as long as it's done with respect and non-violence. Again, I'm not sure that's the answer that others in this room might want to hear. But you know, that's often be a conversation between a campus community also. I think in my campus, the trust was broken terribly when the president called in the National Guard. I mean, the riot police, not the National Guard. And there was no evidence whatsoever. It was done purely to bring the police to campus and to close down a protest that had gone on peacefully for a couple of weeks, in which donors and alumni wanted it to be closed down. And that was, to me, a very bad move because it actually broke the trust of the whole campus with this particular leader. So, you know, each campus has its own idiosyncrasies, its own culture, its own mechanisms of communication between the student body and the faculty body and the administrative leadership. So, you know, I can't speak on behalf, but at my campus now, I march because that trust was deeply, deeply broken. So, you know, and everyone's different and everyone has their sort of, you know, mechanisms of what they can do. I'm also a full professor, and if I get arrested, it's going to be okay, right? So, you know, you do what you can do. And I think it's very important that whatever you do, you own and take responsibility and don't call out others that may not join you. That to me is that's awful. Because there's no shame and blame here. We all do what we can do, right?
Hi, my name is, right here, sorry, Flynn Cowie. I'm a neurobio double major in psychology, and I have a question regarding protest, and specifically, was your school, UC Irvine, did they implement protest policies after that event?
They certainly did.
Do you believe that those policies exist as an attack on just academic freedom or free speech together? Because I know you made that contradiction, or the separation of the two, and then additionally, are these anticipatory measures useful in any sense, or are they rather kind of like buckling under the pressure?
So it is a very, I don't have a simple answer. So across the UCs, there's 10 campuses, so it's huge public university system. There were put into time, place, criteria rules, so that, you know, if you want to have a student group, you have to get permission. If you want to have loud music, you have to get permission, and so on. Those rules did exist, but they weren't really enforced previously to the whole sort of student upheaval last year. But they're now quite aggressively enforced. And I don't anticipate there's going to be much student protest at all on the UC campuses this coming fall, because I don't think students, they're fearful. They do not want to be arrested. Each of the 10 campuses have had a different response in their level of punitive punishment to students and faculty that were arrested last year. Some just, you know, waived off the charges, and some further did prosecution. So again, each campus is slightly different, but in my experience, a lot of these time, manner, place rules will have a chilling effect. Will definitely have a chilling effect.
Hi, my name is Will. I'm a double in psych and philosophy. You had mentioned during your talk sort of the relationships globally amongst authoritarian leaning leaders of countries. I just had a question about these relationships. So first off, if you could just say a little bit more about what we're seeing in terms of active engagement with one another, cooperation, sort of planning of sorts. And then I think it's kind of easy to say that there's sort of a pooling of money. We had mentioned sort of billionaire interests of Elon and so forth, but do you see any other sort of specific motivations that are driving the connections amongst these global leaders as we sort of see a rise in this sort of authoritarian government style?
It's a great question. There's also long, complicated kinds of ways we could talk about it. I do think there is a global political economic destabilization in which the dominance of the U.S. Pax Americana kind of Washington consensus has been brought into question and challenged as you see China and other big economies coming into play. So that's been going on for like 20, 25 years, this sort of shift in the global political economy and the stability of the US dominance in that. So that gives rise to different kinds of opportunities, and certainly under neoliberal policies which favor big business, big oil, big banks and so on, for there to be a sort of shift in accountability in terms of public and the leadership that's representing them. So, there is a great deal of conversation between, for instance, Hungary's Prime Minister Viktor Orban, who came in 2018, and Trump, and a great deal of conversations between Putin and Trump, and a great deal of conversations between Milei, who came in 2023 in Argentina, and Trump, and Modi, and it goes on and on and on. So they are actually in quite a lot of communication with each other, though they're often in, these relationships are often very sort of shaky, as we've seen, as I mentioned, between Modi and Trump. But it is really a cadre of people who are watching each other and looking at their strategies. So for instance, you probably all remember, maybe you don't, to me it was horrifying, where Elon Musk had the chainsaw, right? And he was doing his ridiculous antics. Well, Milei, the very extreme far-right prime minister who came in 23 in Argentina, he came in on a campaign thrashing around with a chainsaw, and that chainsaw he actually gave to Trump. So behind the scenes, they're actually even mimicking their own campaign slogans and slapping each other on the back and thinking this is all fun games. So there is that. And then I think in terms of the Elon Musks of this world, it is about power and greed. It really, with the leadership, the political leadership, and the capitalist leadership, it's a great synergy if you're about power and greed. In a really simple way. Sort of.
So you talk a lot in your talk about the importance of student protests. How do you suggest students to navigate fear of student protests or violence or arrests? How do you recommend that students navigate that situation?
A good question. It depends on how, what the sort of fear levels are. I don't know what to say. I don't know what to say. I mean, if you feel that you are in fear of violence and so on, then you need to step back. I mean, you cannot go into the fray. We are just, people, we're ordinary people, we're not Superman, right? And so you should never participate in any protest in which you feel that you are personally subject to some kind of violence. You need to walk away fast. So that's my first comment. And a lot of the fear is deliberately being manufactured. So I think it's sort of in a quieter moment. Think about why you feel you are in fear or anxious, because that's literally a sort of manufactured sort of anxiety that the media is pumping out, that you should be in fear, you should be ducking and weaving, and you may not need to be at all, I don't know. I really don't know. So I think it's also about a quiet reflection about where that anxiety is coming from in terms of your own personal space and so on. But certainly if you ever feel in violent circumstances, you need to walk away and get help.
Okay, we're going to take one more question. And then there's dessert reception in the lobby, and we'll be able to continue the conversation.
Absolutely. With sugar in our hands.
Hello, I'm Ethan. Oh, is that not me?
Okay, 2 people were called on simultaneously. Perhaps we can take both questions and then get one answer. Okay, let's hear both questions.
And then we can talk outside. So
No, there are 3 people? Oh dear, this is not...
why don't we all talk outside? I think like it's not fair to take one over the other. I will be out there and you can all come and chat to me, okay?
Okay, thank you so much.